You have coined this concept, surveillance capitalism, some years ago, about 5 years ago. What does it mean?
Surveillance capitalism. Okay, so most of us understand that, capitalism has evolved over the centuries. And even though there are some enduring principles of capitalism, it takes different forms in different eras, depending on the technology and the state of society and so forth. So what's happened in our era, in the digital century, is a new presentation of capitalism, a new economic logic, a new way of creating wealth. So let me explain what that is. One of the enduring principles of capitalism is that it evolves by taking things that live outside the marketplace, outside the domain of market exchange, and it brings them into the marketplace. And it turns them into things that we call commodities, things that can be sold and purchased. Okay, yes. So I think most of us understand industrial capitalism, which dominated the 19th and 20th centuries. Industrial capitalism took nature from outside the marketplace and it brought it in and it turned it into things that we call land, things we call real estate, forests that could be purchased and sold, rivers that were repurposed as sources of power that could be sold and purchased. So nature became commodified. And that is what drove industrial capitalism and allowed it to create so much wealth. Okay, now fast forward into the digital century, yes. The 21st century. Capitalism is scanning the horizon, looking for what is the new source of raw materials, the new source of free assets that we can turn into commodities. And what it hit upon was us, private human experience. This happened first at Google, but let me just explain it in principle initially. What it means is that our private human experience became redefined as a free source of raw material to be claimed by the new processes of computerization, translated into data, behavioral data. Those behavioral data now flow through all kinds of supply chains. For example, the screen that I'm talking to you through a screen right now, this screen is a supply chain interface. And the systems through which we are recording and the third-party applications that those systems also feed, all of these are ecosystems of supply chains that are scraping some data from our interaction and flowing it through these pipes, through these supply chains, into 21st century factories.
Which kind of factories are those?
What is a 21st century factory? It's a computational factory. The tech companies call it artificial intelligence, machine learning. These are the new computational factories. So our data flow into these new factories where they are analyzed, where they are computed. And like every factory, these factories produce products. But in the case of surveillance capitalism, the products that they produce are predictions of our behavior, computational fragments.
Shoshana, let me pose you a question in this point. You have analyzed very carefully the case of Pokemon Go, the game, the virtual reality game that many people all over the world were involved some years ago. Could you explain this case? Because it's very easy to understand the implications of what you are describing when we understand the implications of Pokemon Go.
Yes, I agree. That's a great example. Think about this. What surveillance capitalism produces are predictions of our behavior. These predictions are sold to business customers. Now, as most folks know, the original prediction product was the click-through rate. And the original marketplace where these predictions about our behavior were sold were markets for online targeted ads. And this is when advertisers learn not to decide where their ads should be placed, but to buy the prediction from Google's black box, the click-through rate. And the black box tells the advertiser where to place your ad, where that user is most likely to click on your ad and click through to your website. So that was the first big success of this new logic.
In the online world, not in the real world, but in the online environment.
In the online world. Now, if you're going to be in a competition to produce great predictions about our behavior, it turns out that there are three things that you need. And these are what I call the economic imperatives. First of all, you need a lot of behavioral data. It started in online and then it went offline, right? Because it started with everything we do in searching and browsing and our social media behavior online. But then pretty soon they invented the smartphone, which is a little pocket-sized computer. You put it in your pocket or your purse, you take it out in the world with you, and you put a lot of apps on it. And those apps are streaming everything about what you're doing. The phone itself is streaming everything about your location and often, you know, what you're saying and what you're doing, what you're buying, what you're eating, who you're with, all of these kinds of data streams. So first we have volumes of data, and then the next thing we have are varieties of data, economies of scale and economies of scope. The machines need both of those things to make great predictions. Now, let's get to Pokemon Go. In the competition for great predictions, eventually surveillance capitalists understood that the very best predictions come from actually intervening in our behavior, learning how to tune, to herd, to shape and modify our behavior, pushing us in the direction that improves their predictions, because that makes their predictions more lucrative. It makes them worth more, and it improves their revenues. It makes them more competitive. This new arena is what I call economies of action. We have scale, we have scope, we have action. How do you get lots of people to behave in the way you want them to behave without ever meeting them, without ever touching them? This is not a situation where, you know, you've got the soldiers knocking on your door in the middle of the night, threatening you and dragging you off to the gulag or the camp. This is a kind of power to shape our behavior.
Soft power.
A kind of, it's a soft power. I call it instrumentarian power, because it works through the milieu, through the medium of digital instruments, and it works subliminally on our behavior. It triggers, it cues, it uses social comparison dynamics. It does these very subtle things in order to successfully shape and direct our behavior.
But when kids and children and adults were involved or engaged with Pokemon Go, they thought that they were just entertaining and having a good time, but something else was happening.
You're absolutely right. Okay, what was really happening was that the game we were playing was a game within a game. Economies of action, as I suggested, this is a new experimental zone. No one knows how to do this. And so both within Facebook and within Google, we saw very interesting new kinds of experiments being tried to figure out how to modify human behavior at scale. Pokemon Go is a game that was invented at Google. It was incubated at Google for many years by the same people who oversaw the Street View effort where they came to all of our neighborhoods and
Yes.
They recorded all of our streets and they mapped our neighborhoods and our cities and our homes. The same people who did Google Earth and who did Street View did Pokemon Go. And the real game here was that businesses, some of them very important global businesses like McDonald's and Starbucks, but others perhaps local businesses like the local pizzeria or the local bar. These businesses were paying the game for the privilege of having the game push people's behavior into these establishments where they would spend money.
Yes.
Right? So just as in the online world, you have advertisers paying for click-through rate,
Yes.
which is how we walk with our fingers, clicking our way through. In this real world game of Pokemon Go, you had the McDonald's and the Starbucks paying the company that ultimately was spun off from Google to bring it to market because they didn't want to bring it to market as Google.
Yes.
So they brought it to market as something called Niantic Labs. These entities, these companies were paying Niantic Labs for guaranteed footfall. So instead of walking with our fingers online, we're walking with our real feet and our real bodies in the real world to go to those establishments where we would probably spend money.
Shoshana, this difference that while we are going from an online environment to the real life and making people they do not know that they are some way obeying a pattern that was created by a company. They are guided to a certain shop, a certain business. Why is this kind of different scale or different step worse and more worrying?
All right. Well, think about what we've just said. So now there are digital systems. In the case of Pokemon Go, of course, it's mediated by our phone, but the phone is not only full of sensors and the apps and so forth. When the forensic analysts looked at Pokemon Go, they realized that it was taking so much data from our phones that went way beyond anything that was necessary for us to play this game. That's because they're feeding these profiles of us and they're learning how to trigger our behavior with specific kinds of messaging, specific kinds of social comparison dynamics, subliminal cues. In the case of Pokemon Go and other forms of economies of action, they use gamification, real-time rewards and punishments. Real-time rewards and punishments to get us to go this way, go that way, or behave this way, behave that way. So this was experimental, but it was incredibly successful. They learned that without game players ever knowing, completely outside of our awareness, they could successfully direct us to the places that they wanted us to go because that's where they were going to get paid. All right? So here we have this new kind of power.
I have a question in this point, Shoshana. The big issue here is not they are not just predicting what we are freely going to do, but they are just creating what we are going to do. This is the main danger thing.
This is what is called, in psychology, is called behavior modification. And the idea is that you can use rewards and punishments, what psychologists call reinforcements. Very often they're subliminal, so we have no idea that they're occurring, but these can be used to shape our behavior. Now we have an economic logic, a form of capitalism, that is using the density and intensity of digital instrumentation, which has become the environment in which we all live, starting with our phones and our computers, but the sensors, the cameras, the devices, Now it's becoming the television set, the dishwasher, the dashboard in my car, the sensors that are all through the city, and the platform that my doctor's office uses, or the platform that my children's school uses. All of these things are part of these ecosystems of data flows. And so all of this can be used to analyze us, to know how to trigger us and send us cues, get us involved in messages about what other people are doing and what friends of ours are doing that make us want to do it, and also sending us rewarding and punishing signals that shape our behavior. This now happens in a way that, because it bypasses our awareness, it robs us of autonomy.
But this is the problem. The problem is that we don't. We are not aware. We don't know. We are ignorant of this mechanism underneath our very daily common routines. The problem is not knowing, or the problem is that it is happening. If we knew that this is happening, it could be different.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of power is this that can shape human behavior at scale? Pokemon Go made a lot of money in a lot of cities, in a lot of countries, and it still does, right? So this is something that these are systems that have been, tested and proven. Now you have insurance companies, for example. They want you to drive in a way that will lower their risks, lower their costs. So now we have insurance companies that use, for example, telemetry to monitor your behavior in your car. They can tell where the direction of your gaze, they can tell the pressure of your foot on the gas pedal, and they can reward you and punish you in real time, raising your premiums or lowering your premiums in order to get you to drive the way they want you to drive, to lower their risks and therefore their costs. You see? So now these become systems that are ubiquitous and they're hidden. The fact is that they are designed to keep us in ignorance. They're designed to be secret, ergo the surveillance in surveillance capitalism. But these systems are becoming institutionalized. And what that means is that our autonomy and our agency as human beings is systematically being suppressed in ways that we can't resist because we can't become aware that it's happening.
Shoshana, there is this idea of Big Brother that everybody knows, the idea of an Orwellian dystopia with a big power able to control our lives and punish us if we do not follow the way of living that the big power is imposing. But this is a very, negative way of conceiving this new capitalism. Is this related to the way you are conceiving the new economy and the new capitalisms, the surveillance capitalism?
Look, Big Brother, of course, was the signature metaphor for totalitarianism, 20th century totalitarianism. And, Big Brother is a kind of surveillance that is literally in your face. Yeah. Everybody knows that it's happening all the time. And it represents a kind of power that is backed up by violence and murder, right? So these are totalitarian systems that we learned about through tremendous tragedy in the 20th century. One of the problems is that instrumentarian power, very often, as we come into contact with it and begin to learn about it, we tend to think about it in terms of these, 20th century experiences of totalitarian power. But it's really nothing like that. It wants total control, yes, but it doesn't threaten violence and it doesn't threaten murder. It comes with a cappuccino. It comes offering us convenience. It comes with a smile and a game. But two things are happening that put it on a collision course with democracy. Number one, it overrides human autonomy. And because it begins to fill our social spaces, which we've seen happening now with the COVID situation, increasingly we have no escape. So as it fills our social situations and gets more control over who we are and how to trigger and exercise this new kind of power over our behavior, we have nowhere to escape it and we don't know what's happening. So it suppresses human autonomy, without which democracy is inconceivable. But just to finish that thought,
yes.
Luciana, from the top, so we have suppressing human autonomy right at the grassroots. From the top, what's happening is these systems, which belong to the Googles and the Facebooks, the Amazon, Microsoft, these systems are now amassing huge concentrations of knowledge about us. That knowledge about us is the basis for accruing this new form of power over us. So here we are in the digital century. This was meant to be democracy's golden age, the democratization of information.
But let me ask you a question.
Of knowledge.
Let me ask you a question, Shoshana, because for some people, what you are explaining could sound as a very conspirative theory regarding the way it's working. And at the same time, we could see that when it was the last USA election, the same happened to Brexit. So how, if this world is so surveyed by capitalism and there is this huge amount of information and patterns that these new fabrics, how do you call companies, are fabricating, are making, how these big mistakes are happening and democracy is still showing very great levels of freedom in terms of what polls are able to guess?
Okay, that's a great question, and I'm glad you raised that issue about sounding kind of conspiratorial. That's why I wrote a very long book.
Yes.
I wrote a very long
very
book.
Interesting, great book.
It took 7 years to write it because it is full of data.
Yes.
Right, because it can sound kind of science fiction like. But it's not. And so this is why I very carefully bring the reader through all of the evidence, which is now widely accepted. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, let's talk about Facebook for a moment. We learn a lot about surveillance capitalism from whistleblowers and from documents that are leaked from these companies, because it's, as I said, these systems are designed to keep us in ignorance. So it's pretty hard to learn about them. It takes a lot of work. Okay, so a leaked Facebook document gives us an insight into what we talked about as its computational factor. What we learned from this document is that in its AI hub, is how they call it, their machines ingest, take in trillions of data points every day, trillions of data points, of behavioral data points every day. And they produce 6 million predictions of human behavior every second. Every second. Okay. Now, what is this, this leaked document? It talked about what they do with these data. And the big example that they use to show how great this is what they called loyalty prediction. So with these data, they can pinpoint through all kinds of triangulation somebody who is about to be disloyal to a brand. So instead of buying Nike, I'm about to buy Adidas, okay? And what they do is they can signal their customer, Nike, and they can say, Shoshana is about to be disloyal. Here's the kind of message you should send her. Here's when you should send it. Here's what you should say. Offer the discount, offer the free shipping. Do it right at this particular moment, and you will pull her back and reaffirm her brand loyalty. Okay? So this is an example. Now, let's fast forward to Brexit and the 2016 presidential elections, where eventually we discovered by 2018 the scandal of Cambridge Analytica. And with Cambridge Analytica, we began to learn about some of its inner workings from a man named Chris Wiley, a whistleblower, who was one of the architects of Cambridge Analytica strategies. What did he say? He said, we had so much data about you that we learned how to, we learned how to understand what are your inner demons, and we learned how to use all of this data to specifically trigger your inner demons to get you to join a group that you wouldn't otherwise have joined, or read material that you wouldn't otherwise have read, or perhaps even go to a rally or go to a meeting that you never would have attended, right? In other words, the exact same methods that Cambridge Analytica used were the methods that have been perfected within Google, within Facebook, within these companies, in order to learn how to, as we said before, tune, herd, modify our behavior in the direction of their commercial goals, right? So we have a pivot with Cambridge Analytica to doing the exact same thing, but now not toward commercial objectives, but toward political objectives.
The two last question is,
yes, please.
The first one is, in which way the handling of the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, with artificial intelligence, very spread all over the world, is adding a new step to this logic that now is applied to our bodies?
Okay, so this is such an important question for all of us right now. I think one of the key things that everybody should understand is that companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon, these companies have now for several years been quite public about their intention to take over the health industry, just the way they own and operate the internet in general. Okay, so the same thing that happened to journalism and the news industry, they have been determined to impose that same kind of disruption on the healthcare industry. So that is the context. When COVID hit, it's not surprising that Google and Apple, were right out of the gate with their contact tracing app. They had help with it, of course, from Swiss scientists and others to make their capabilities available. Why? Because, as you suggested, they want our bodies. Why do they want our bodies? Because our health, everything that's going on inside and outside our bodies, these are some of the most predictive sources of data that can possibly be imagined, and they want them. They have made no secret of that now for quite a while.
Shoshana, the very last question is there any kind of positive side of this new surveillance capitalism? Because in the cases of COVID-19, it helped to contain the epidemic.
So even though the outline that I've just proposed to you may seem a little grim, and it may seem like it's pointing us toward dystopia, in fact, it is my belief right now, and I think there is just growing evidence to support this, that it is having the opposite effect. Instead of pointing us toward dystopia, I think the fundamental situation here is there has just been too much toothpaste out of the tube. Over these past couple of years, especially since Cambridge Analytica, We have learned so much about these systems. Nobody wants to be inside these systems. Nobody wants to participate in surveillance capitalism. Thinking explicitly about how do we create a digital future that is compatible with democracy. Mm-hmm. We don't want to become like China, mm-hmm. where increasingly social behavior is surveyed in a totalizing way, not to kill people, not to be violent, but to control them and mm-hmm. to force them to act in a way that is consistent with the political objectives of the Chinese state. That's the kind of world that we're in danger of, driven by market objectives rather than by political objectives. But I think that there is so much resistance now and awareness. We're seeing a boycott of advertisers against Facebook. We're seeing lawmakers mobilized in Europe, in America, and in Latin America, and Costa Rica, all over the world. Okay. I think that we are actually coming into a period of awakening and resistance where the days of surveillance capitalism will quickly be brought to an end because it is fundamentally an illegitimate economic logic that steals from us in a way that we never agreed to, that we're not allowed to know about, and that we can't resist. That is fundamentally illegitimate and at odds with the aspirations of every democratic society.
It is so clear. Thank you so much, Shoshana Zuboff.